A mother stood at the edge of the shore, her feet sinking into the wet sand, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky kissed the sea. In her trembling hands, she clutched a small wooden carving, a toy boat her son had made before he left. He was only 16, too young to hold a sword, too young to die, but old enough to stand between his home and the empire that wanted to swallow it whole. She whispered his name into the wind, knowing he would never hear it again.
Merciful God,
The
why
waves
have you
carried her
forsaken
voice
me?
away, just as they had carried away the laughter of her child, the warmth of his embrace, the future he would never live. Somewhere out there, beyond the mist and the salt and the blood, her boy had become a memory, and she was left with nothing but this tiny wooden boat and the unbearable weight of a question she would ask every sunrise for the rest of her life. Was it worth it? Did his sacrifice mean anything?
Look out! Here
Or did
they
he
come!
die so that men with crowns
tide
could
is
draw
low.
new
We
lines
should head
on
out now.
maps? You are about to hear a story that
Be careful
history
near the
tried to
rocks.
bury. A story of mothers who lost sons, of fathers who sent their boys to fight monsters made of wood and iron, of an island so
She's
small
coming
it does
hard.
not even appear on most
Batten
maps.
down the hatches,
And
lads.
yet,
We haven't much time.
this island did something no kingdom, no empire, no army had ever done. It made the most powerful navy in the world turn around and sail home in shame. But before you hear how they won, you need to understand what they lost. Because victory is not measured in ships sunk or battles won. It is measured in the letters that were never written, the voices that will never again call out across the fields, the empty chairs at every dinner table. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about survival. And survival always comes with a price. Why does history celebrate the empires but forget the islands? Why do we remember the names of admirals but not the fishermen who outwitted them? Maybe because the truth is uncomfortable. Maybe because it reminds us that power is not always enough. That sometimes the smallest flame can burn down the largest ship. And maybe, just maybe, because this story proves that those who fight for their home will always fight harder than those who fight for glory. So do not scroll past this. Do not look away. Because what you are about to witness is not just a battle. It is a masterclass in desperation, ingenuity, and the kind of courage that only comes when you have nothing left to lose. This is the story of how an island of farmers forced the world's strongest navy to retreat. And it begins not with a battle cry, but with silence. The silence of a sea that was about to swallow an empire whole. The island was not remarkable. It had no grand castles, no marble temples, no streets paved with gold. It was a patch of green earth surrounded by cold, unforgiving water. The people who lived there were fishermen, farmers, and traders. They woke before dawn to pull nets from the sea. They planted crops in soil that tasted of salt. They built their homes from wood and stone, and they lived simple lives. But simple does not mean weak. These people knew the sea better than any admiral who had ever commanded a fleet. They knew when the tides would rise and when they would fall. They knew which currents would carry a boat safely to shore and which would smash it against the rocks. They knew the reefs that hid beneath the surface like sleeping serpents, waiting to tear open the belly of any ship foolish enough to come too close. And they knew the storms, the old ones, the ones whose skin was weathered by wind and whose eyes had seen 1,000 sunsets. They could read the sky like a book. They could tell you 3 days in advance when the heavens would open and the sea would rage. This knowledge had been passed down through generations, whispered from grandfather to grandson, from mother to daughter. It was not written in books. It was carved into their bones. For years, the island had been left alone. It was too small to matter, too poor to conquer. But empires do not care about size. They care about control. And this island sat at the mouth of a trade route that carried silk, spices, and gold from the east to the west. Whoever controlled the island controlled the flow of wealth. And so, the empire decided it was time to take what did not belong to them. They sent word to the island. Surrender, or be destroyed. The message arrived on a bright morning, delivered by a single ship flying the empire's colors. The islanders gathered at the docks to read the demand. Some wanted to surrender. What chance did they have against the most powerful navy in the world? Others wanted to fight. But fight with what? Fishing boats? Farming tools? One old man, a former sailor who had lost his leg to a shark decades ago, stepped forward. He looked at the gathered crowd, at the young men who had never held a sword, at the women who had never known war, at the children who still played in the dirt without a care. And he said something that would echo through the weeks to come. He said, "We do not need to be stronger than them. We just need to be smarter." The Empire did not wait long for a response. When none came, they launched their armada. 200 ships. Warships built from oak and iron, armed with cannons that could turn stone walls into dust. Soldiers trained since childhood to kill without hesitation. Admirals who had conquered cities, burned fleets, and brought kings to their knees. This was not just an invasion. It was a statement, a message to every island, every coast, every nation that dared to defy the Empire. Resist, and you will be erased. The Armada set sail on a calm day. The winds were favorable. The sea was smooth as glass. The sailors sang songs of victory, already imagining the gold they would take, the land they would claim, the glory that would be theirs. The admirals stood on the decks of their flagship, studying maps, planning the invasion. It would be over in a day, they thought. Maybe two. The island had no defenses, no walls, no army. It would fall before the sun set. But the sea has no loyalty to empires. The islanders knew the Armada was coming. They had scouts, fishermen who sailed out in small boats and watched the horizon. When the first sails appeared, they raced back to shore and sounded the alarm. There was no time to waste. The plan had been prepared for weeks. Every man, woman, and child knew their role. The fishermen pulled their boats to shore, not to hide them, but to prepare them. The farmers gathered barrels of fish oil, tar, and anything else that would burn. The women sewed sails treated with pitch. The children collected stones and packed them into sacks. And the old sailor, the one who had lost his leg, stood at the highest point on the island, watching the sky, waiting. The Empire expected fear. They expected chaos. They expected the islanders to flee or beg for mercy. Instead, they found an eerie calm. The docks were empty. The villages were silent. No smoke rose from chimneys. No lights flickered in the windows. It was as if the island had been abandoned. The admirals found this suspicious, but not alarming. They ordered the fleet to advance, slowly, carefully. They did not want to run aground on hidden rocks. But the maps they carried were old, and the sea is always changing. As the Armada entered the shallow waters near the island, the first ships began to slow. Their hulls scraped against something beneath the surface. Reefs, sandbars, rocks that should not have been there according to the maps. The admirals ordered the ships to adjust course to find deeper water. But every direction they turned, they found more obstacles. It was as if the sea itself was conspiring against them. The truth was simpler. The islanders had spent weeks marking false channels, planting stakes in the water, moving buoys to mislead anyone who tried to navigate by them. They had turned the sea into a maze, and the Empire had sailed right into it. Ships began to collide with each other, their oars tangling, their sails catching the wind at wrong angles. Sailors shouted orders, but the confusion only grew. And then, as the sun began to set, the islanders made their first move. Small boats appeared from behind the island, dozens of them, moving fast and low across the water. They were not warships. They were fishing boats, barely large enough to hold 3 men. But each one was loaded with barrels of oil and tar, and each one had been set on fire. The fireboats. The admirals saw them coming and laughed. What damage could a few burning fishing boats do to a fleet of warships? But the islanders were not aiming for the warships. They were aiming for the spaces between them. The fireboats slipped through the gaps in the Armada, their flames leaping from boat to boat, spreading across the oil-slicked water. Within minutes, the sea was on fire. Sailors screamed as the flames climbed the sides of their ships. Captains barked orders to cut the lines, to push burning vessels away, but there was no room to maneuver. The ships were packed too tightly together, trapped by the reefs and the chaos. And the fire spread. Sails caught first, great sheets of canvas bursting into flame like paper. Then the decks, soaked with tar from years at sea. Then the rigging, the masts, the very bones of the ships. The Empire's pride, its unbeatable armada, was burning alive. But the islanders were not done. As the fire raged, they sent out another wave of boats. this time carrying archers. Not soldiers, but farmers and fishermen who had spent their lives hunting birds and seals. They knew how to aim. They knew how to kill. They fired arrows into the smoke, into the confusion, targeting officers, targeting anyone who tried to restore order. The Empire's sailors, trained to fight on land and sea, found themselves helpless. They could not see their enemy. They could not fight back. All they could do was watch as their ships burned and sank. By midnight, 20 ships were at the bottom of the sea. By dawn, 50 more were damaged beyond repair. The admirals, furious and humiliated, ordered a retreat. They pulled back to deeper water, out of range of the fire and the arrows. They would regroup, they said. They would return with a new plan. But the islanders knew something the admirals did not. The storm was coming. The old sailor had been watching the sky for days. He had seen the signs. The way the clouds moved. The way the gulls flew inland. The way the wind shifted and died and shifted again. He had felt it in his bones, the way old men feel the rain before it falls. A storm was coming. Not a small one. Not a squall that would pass in an hour. A monster. The kind of storm that flattened forests and swallowed ships whole. He had told the others, and they had believed him. Because in this place, you did not doubt the old ones. You listened. And so the islanders waited. They pulled their boats high onto the shore. They tied down their roofs. They gathered in the strongest buildings and prayed. And they watched the horizon. The Empire's fleet, battered and burned, sat in the deep water, waiting for dawn to launch another attack. The admirals were confident. They had lost ships, yes, but they still had numbers. They still had cannons. They still had the might of the Empire behind them. The islanders were clever, they admitted, but cleverness would not stop iron and fire. Tomorrow, they would crush the island and make an example of its people. But tomorrow never came. The storm arrived in the night, without warning, without mercy. The sky turned black. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at sails and snapping masts like twigs. The sea rose up in waves taller than the ships, walls of water that crashed down with the weight of mountains. The Empire's fleet was caught in the open water, with no shelter, no harbor, no escape. Ships capsized. Sailors were swept overboard, swallowed by the dark. Cannons broke loose and smashed through decks. Masts fell, crushing men beneath them. The flagship, the pride of the fleet, split in half and sank in minutes. Admirals drowned alongside common sailors. There was no rank in the storm, no glory, only survival. And most did not survive. By the time the sun rose, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the wreckage told the story. Broken wood floated on the surface. Bodies washed up on the shore. The Empire's great armada, the fleet that had conquered nations, was gone. Destroyed not by an army, but by an island of farmers who knew the sea better than any admiral ever could. The survivors, what few there were, limped back to the Empire in damaged ships, carrying tales of fire and storm and an island cursed by the gods. The Emperor, furious at the loss, demanded another invasion. But his admirals refused. They had seen what the island could do. They had felt the power of the sea and the cunning of its people. To return would be suicide. And so, for the first time in its history, the Empire retreated. Not because it was defeated in battle, but because it realized that some places cannot be conquered. Some people cannot be broken. The island was left alone. The trade route remained open, but no fleet dared to claim it. The Empire's power, once thought infinite, had been challenged by fishermen and farmers. And the world took notice. Years later, historians would write about the battle, but they would get it wrong. They would say it was luck. They would say it was the storm, an act of God, a freak of nature. They would say the islanders were saved by chance. But the islanders knew the truth. It was not luck. It was knowledge. It was preparation. It was the courage to stand against an empire when surrender seemed like the only option. It was the willingness to sacrifice everything, to risk everything, for the simple right to live free. And it was the understanding that the sea is not a battlefield. It is a living thing, with moods and rhythms and secrets. And those who respect it, who learn from it, who listen to it, will always have an advantage over those who see it as just another obstacle to overcome. The mother who stood on the shore, clutching the wooden boat, never saw her son again. His body was never found, but she heard the stories. She heard how the young men of the island had sailed into the fire, how they had faced the Empire's fleet without hesitation, how they had given everything so that others could live. And she understood, finally, what her son had known, that some things are worth dying for, that freedom is not given, it is taken, and that sometimes the smallest light can hold back the greatest darkness. The wooden boat she held became a symbol. Other mothers, other fathers, other families who had lost loved ones, they carved their own boats and placed them in a shrine at the highest point of the island. A reminder, a memorial, a promise that the sacrifice would not be forgotten, that the island would remain free, and that no empire, no matter how powerful, could ever take that away. Today, the island still stands. The people still fish, still farm, still live simple lives. But they remember. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, they gather at the shore and light fires on the water. Small flames, floating on wooden boats, drifting out to sea. A tribute to those who burned so that others could live. And as the fires disappear into the darkness, the old ones tell the story again. To the children, to the young, to anyone who will listen. They tell them about the empire that came with 200 ships. They tell them about the fire and the storm and the sea that swallowed an armada whole. They tell them that power is not everything. That knowledge is stronger than cannons. That courage is more dangerous than any weapon. And they tell them to never forget. Because the world will always have empires. It will always have those who believe they can take whatever they want. But it will also always have islands. Small, stubborn, unbreakable islands. And as long as those islands stand, as long as their people remember who they are and what they are capable of, no empire will ever be truly unstoppable. This is the story history tried to forget. The story of farmers who became warriors, of fishermen who became legends, of an island that proved that size does not matter, that strength is not measured in ships or soldiers, that sometimes the greatest weapon is knowing the land, the sea, and the sky better than your enemy ever could. And that when you fight for your home, when you fight for your family, when you fight for the simple right to exist, you become something more than human. You become a force of nature, just like the storm that saved them, just like the sea that swallowed their enemies, just like the fire that burned across the water and lit up the night. The empire never returned, and the island never surrendered.